Thinking about how the echoes of the 19th century slavery shaped our societies today, wondering how the past informs the future of the Bahamas. Pause, think about it with intentional thought, and consider where we go from here. Stay tuned and hear what Professor Laura Rosanne Adderley got to say about the legacies of slavery and the unsung heroes that shaped our nation. You will gain insights into how understanding our history can empower communities, inform government policies, and inspire new generations of Bahamian leaders.
Something to think about with Dale Happy Knowles. What we think, we become. What we radiate, we attract. What we imagine, we surely can achieve. Let's change the narrative, 242.
Welcome to Something to Think About with Dale Happy Knowles 242 and all y'all across the world. Be sure to comment, like, share, all those good things. Let us know where you are, what you're thinking, and what you want this lovely guest of mine today to answer for you. Because we're going to go deep into the annals of our history in this world. Whether you are this hue, that hue, another hue, whatever hue it is, but it's all going to pivot around the Atlantic slave trade. Welcome, Professor. How are you today?
It's good to be here. I love these sorts of things.
Awesome. Now, I got plenty names for you, so which one you want me to use officially today? Because,
Yes, Rosanne Adderley is the name I prefer.
Okay.
Laura is my legal name, and it has a history that if I have a chance, I will discuss.
Sure. Awesome. All right. Yes, well, your bio is on the page, and it's really, I don't want to tie up the show because I want you to address whatever we have to talk about, but people, you could check it out in the description, and but if you could just lead us with a couple of things that you would like us to highlight at this point in time, and then some of them we might go and highlight along the way.
Yeah, one of the things, and I like the intro to the show.
Oh boy, thank you.
Because it says, what you think, you become.
Mm-hmm.
And I tell people all the time, I have a fortunate job because I teach history. And so I can when I walk around the Bahamas or almost anywhere I am on this side of the Atlantic, like not in Europe or something, I think about how slavery and colonialism made places where we live. That's just, that's just the reality of, but I literally, the regular phone never rings. It will stop. Like a cell phone, you can't cut it off. I still have a real phone.
Mm.
I literally get paid. It is my job to think about the history of the 19th century. But one of my hopes with programming like this, and one of my hopes for all of us, is that when we think about a long time ago, or how things got the way they are, that we actually get out of the 1900s, out of the moment of independence, and out of even the 2000s.
Right.
And think people will say often, oh, Bahamians always fill in the blank. Or Junkanoo used to fill in the blank. And I said, Are you talking about used to 1972, used to 1885? So that's one of my hopes for this conversation. I think the second big hope is that we are about to come up on some pretty big anniversaries in the next coming years, because 2038, God spare life, who knows, some of us will be here for that. That'll mark 200 years since the end of racialized slavery in the Bahamas, in the British colonized Caribbean.
Okay.
And I think it's an opportune time for us to think about how our societies came to be they are. And we are still a post-colonial society. We get reminded of that in some of the discussions about the Commonwealth and about whether we should be a republic and what our relationship to Britain is.
Yeah.
But we are also reminded about it in the everyday. Someone asked, as the bio says, I live in New Orleans, Louisiana.
Hmm.
And one of the most interesting things people said after the flooding that happened here after Hurricane Katrina, a very smart sociologist said, instead of just talking about racism and poverty and bad infrastructure, we should go all the way back and ask, how did so many people with African ancestors end up in New Orleans? Because
Hmm.
until we ask that question, and he said, ask the big question, you can ask an easy question: who didn't pay for the right kind of drainage? Who allowed an industrial development that, but he says, no, you must ask. And that's also when we look around the Caribbean and we don't see um, Taino or Arawak or Kalinago people walking
Hmm.
around. We see a lot of people that we might call black,
Hmm.
but who are clearly have African ancestors. We should ask ourselves, because we are interested in how they got there. I think
Right.
the last thing, and why I like talking about the 19th century, is that we, in our everyday lives, we often forget how even a small place like the Bahamas is central to all kinds of relationships, not
Right.
just with the United States, not just with the colonizing power of Great Britain, but with all these European colonial powers, and with our neighbors to the south in Cuba and
Hmm.
Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Not because we happen, like many people in the Bahamas who make their living on the sea, whether that be in the Defense Force or fisheries or some of our sea related tourism. They, for
Right.
example, know a good deal about the present day Dominican Republic. We all, everybody in the Bahamas knows a little bit about the present day United States,
Right.
but our relationships to those places go back many more years, and who we are. Like most Bahamians, I am anxious about the way that United States based mass cultural productions, whether they be the television, movies, music,
Hmm.
influence the Bahamas in this very heavy way. And now, because of technology, the volume is very high. But that
Yeah.
is not new.
Nope.
There's a lot of fun conversations in the Bahamas now about about the relationships between our Junkanoo and the historic Junkanoo in North Carolina, or the Junkanoo in Jamaica, and everybody's Junkanoo can be special and still be related to one another.
Hmm.
It was a I remind people all the time that we have a long history. I know immigration makes people in all societies anxious. I just finished a little essay with a group of Europeans who are like, what can the 19th century and what anxieties about migration then can
Hmm.
tell us about anxieties in Europe about migration now. And so, we are like, even, and in the case of Europe, they are anxious about the people crossing the Mediterranean. All
Right.
right. And so I'm hoping that we can think about
Or the
like the
Gaza Strip.
big, exactly, big
Mhm.
picture things. Or like when people talk about something like the war in Gaza now, it's like, what were the relationships between nations? All right. When I don't know what, and this is just out of my ignorance, one of the things that I remember fascinating me was when we learned about World War I and the efforts in the 1900s to make things like the League of Nations and the United Nations, and what would structures look like when nations actually talk to one another. And
Right.
now we pay good attention to the United Nations if the prime minister, whoever they might be, makes a speech. But
Yeah.
actually thinking about those relationships long before these formal, like, these were new organizations of the 20th century. But we actually should be thinking about, I think Bahamians would be shocked at how much back and forth there
That
was
happened. Yeah. Hmm.
between the United States and the Bahamas, for example, before there was a plane.
Yeah. Well, my grandmother ran after the plane when it first came, and when most people was running from the plane. But that's another story altogether. But so folks, let us know if you can hear us good. If you want us to tweak something, let us know. So we don't want you to miss any of this tonight. And so, Rosanne, one of the things I like to do on the show, first and foremost, is to define our context. And so, please define for us the Atlantic slave trade, in its context, and who were the beneficiaries and the victims in that process. So, when we talk about these things, why people can understand why we're always talking about this until it seems like that kingdom come.
Yes, I would say the biggest thing, and I love starting there, is that the answer to the question, why are there so many Black people in New Orleans, and the answer to the question, why there's so many Black people in the Bahamas or Jamaica or Cuba, the answer is the same. When European, and that is, we forget the thing with the slave trade, that this was many different European countries, and many people, myself included, wish they were more multilingual, and so that we could talk more with our neighbors in Cuba or Haiti. But in the 1600s, 400 years ago, many different European powers, when they set it about themselves to, in their words, explore other parts of the world, when they tried to build economies in the places where they arrived, they had, in their view, three options. They could find a way to persuade people to come from Europe to do all the work. They thought themselves as explorers and developers, and so they decided that it was their European domination way that they could displace the Native Americans, indigenous people who were already here, and who they could, if they could, make them work for things that Europeans wanted, whether that's mining or agriculture.
Right.
Or they could find some other source. And one of the pieces of this story that is often left out is that Europeans had been in Africa before Columbus sailed the ocean. Right. So they already knew way more about the African continent and systems by which they could do business with various kinds of African leaders. And they had plans for the Americas. And one of the things people argue about, I would say there are two things. Why did they turn so heavily to relying on African labor? And what was the role of people in Africa in this? And in terms of who benefited, Europeans did not have the power, the resources, or the knowledge to go into Africa and run over people and just snatch people up at random. They did have the power to enter into what anyone would call unethical relationships with people who either for their own reasons wanted power. One of the standards I tell people all the time about thinking about Atlantic slave trade history, and they'll say, "Are you accusing me of slave trading?" I said, "No, I'm not. But when you make a business decision, you really should be thinking about who it affects. Is this ethical?" So, for example, the most common way that someone had the misfortune of ending up on a slave ship is because there was some kind of war and they were taken prisoner. But one of the things that we know is that once there were Europeans essentially seeking prisoners, then there were more wars. And so it's, and you can't undo the past and say what war would not have happened if the Europeans were there. Like, were not there. Pretend they never came, and you can't predict that. And it's not a friend of mine, Professor Joe Miller, since passed on. He used to say, and he specialized in African history, there was no merry old Africa where everything was happy and perfect. But presence of the Europeans and their demand for labor then distorted everything. And they had this, then you can. I tell students all the time that they leave a class on the Atlantic slave trade
Mm-hmm.
knowing as much about Central and West Central Africa, so places that are now Angola, Democratic Republic of Congo, Nigeria, Ghana, and so forth. They must know as much about those places as they do about Europeans. So Europeans, they displaced the Native Americans. A lot of people die from European disease, but that's not letting the colonizers off the hook for mistreating people.
Right.
One of the reasons they didn't like enslaving, they often, I should say, enslaving people who are already here, is that they knew the land better. It's not just that they were dying, and they had their people there. So when African captives, they had a displaced population. And the more they found, there's situations in South America where they find places that are now Bolivia, Peru, parts of Colombia where you find gold, silver. There were places where you would have in a mine enslaved Africans, enslaved indigenous people, and some Spanish working. But in a lot of places, especially in the Caribbean, the death of Taino, Kalinago, Arawak populations was so high. There wasn't a lot of mines around. They didn't find a lot of minerals. And they turned to these agricultural economies and to export agricultural products, sugar, mostly sugar, but also coffee, cotton, other tobacco, into Europe. And once one set of people became successful doing it this way, they're like, oh, that African slave trade, those captives that you are using. There's a very well-known case of Dutch in what is now Brazil. Dutch colonizers were using African captives, and then the Portuguese took Brazil from them. They said, well, that was working. Some of those Dutch, they go into the Eastern Caribbean, and English people are like, oh, that worked well. And so they start copying their model, which is why, as I said, I say to modern business people, just because it's the same thing that your parents would tell you in school, just because so-and-so is doing that, is that a right thing to do? All right, or everybody is wearing that or acting that way. Right. That is, and one of the things that this is something. No one had to, my students often think, they ask me like, well, when did they decide? Like there was a meeting in Europe and people decided, okay, but this was once they did decide, once they were taking over land, conquering, wanting it to be economic development. The other thing to think about here is that these are government projects. These are kings and queens, certainly in the 1500s, 1600s, giving out licenses to explore, saying, I did a guest talk at the University of the Bahamas during the pandemic.
Okay.
And the students were like, oh gosh, professor, we hated the Lord's proprietors. We got, because they were like, what were they? Were they governors? They were private people. Everybody learns that in, I think, BJC.
BJC, yeah.
Yeah, the Lord's proprietors. That's literally the government saying, hey, wealthy people, you have the rights to develop and do your best. And they paid some tax to the government, but these were not, this isn't like today where governments might certainly support private business. These were giving out licenses. And once it worked, all right, and in the Caribbean, once that indigenous population died at such a high rate, then you ended up with these societies with these large numbers of Africans. And the last thing I will say, one of the other reasons it became so big was that between disease and the lack of good care for people, mortality rates were high. But if you were making money, you discounted other people. And it's not like they said, let's look around the globe and find some people we think are inferior.
Right.
But they did as Europeans. They assumed we are Christian Europeans and our way of life is right and good. All right. And that became a justification that became kind of self-fulfilling. Like, when you're doing something you shouldn't be doing and you come up with reasons too. And the other thing I will say, they knew it too.
Mm.
I'm about to tomorrow morning. I will teach. I will talk to my students about Thomas Jefferson.
Okay.
And Thomas Jefferson actually said, "I tremble for my country if
Mm-hmm.
there is just God," because he looked around at the way they were conducting themselves, and he said, some of this. So people will often say, do not apply modern day values to the past.
Right.
They knew. Yeah, they knew. And there were debates like, was converting people to Christianity like worth it? Did this make it okay? But they did assume that it was their right
Right.
to
Mm-hmm.
make kind of money. So that's, and people are capable of holding contradictory attitudes.
Yeah, and there's two things to it too. One of the things is it gives comfort to let me call them the oppressor, because it now we or those who are being oppressed are subscribing to things that they do also, and so that affinity joins together. The other thing is I remember African history teacher, not of mine, but one that I met in one of the conferences, saying that one of the reasons in his presentation, one of the reasons why they were so hell bent on the Africans is because of the athletic ability to be able to, I guess, become bigger, stronger, and what have you, to be able to do the type of work that was needed. But this question on the table here now is, how did the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade specifically influence social economic structures in the Caribbean?
I would say it influenced it most significantly in what did not happen after it. There were
Boy.
two things. Once you did have, and they were a minority.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to say something slightly political, but I want people, especially in the Bahamas, to think about the numbers. We want to think that abolitionists, they must have been numerous. There must have been many, many of them. People who were truly anti-slavery, who had decided this is wrong, we must stop doing it.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't a small number of people, but they were very much like the DNA is in our politics. They are numerous, right, but they are not by any stretch of the imagination the majority. And there was there were sort of three loud critiques. One was definitely a moral one. Why are we still doing this? We should not do it. There was also an economic critique that this is not an efficient way to run society. We should do these things. We should do things differently.
Right.
While a lot of money was being made and a lot of the modernization and industrialization in Europe was funded by this colonialism, they said that it is in the 1700s, 1800s that you had the sort of birth of the capitalist system and the free market economies, that we can talk about whether they're good or bad.
Right.
And then you also had a discussion about what kind of societies do we want? Like, what is the future both of after this era of exploration and building up these societies? But as we know in the Bahamas, the agricultural economy in the Bahamas was never great. But in all places, even where there was mining or agriculture, as we see in the present day, economies declined, soil got exhausted. So when the Atlantic slave trade was abolished for certainly the British Empire in 1807, but for most places in those between 1800 and about 1820, and in various ways over the next 50 years, the system of slavery itself. And what did not happen in the Caribbean, two things happened. One was they said, if we're going to do this, how can we do this and still keep the same economies we have? So how can we find a way? We were making money here through agriculture in most places. How can we keep making money mostly in that way? That's how you had definitely a whole new inequity in bringing South Asians, East Asians, to places like Cuba, to Trinidad, to Guyana, because they said maybe we'll find another workforce. Or there was definitely a lot of attempts to coerce, encourage, cajole, whatever, the formerly enslaved people to continue those economies. What did not happen, and on the economic structures, I said we have good governments and bad governments. Every country does, but every government in the present day, in sort of the democratic societies in the Caribbean, they do sit at their cabinet tables and say, sort of what are the best paths forward for this economy. And we may decide that we will live with over dependence on tourism because it covers a lot of bills and raises income, and that there's a market for it. We are increasingly called upon to think about what is the environmental impact of that. What is the impact of not developing other sectors? What did not happen, all right, in the Caribbean in any large scale way was, let's step back and think about what does it mean to have societies in some places where the majority of the population is formally enslaved.
Right.
All right, what would it mean to build up a society where they could be strengthened and that we could have diverse working and middle class economies, healthy and good agriculture, both for subsistence and for that kind of planning? It was, how can we keep the economy we had? And then add kind of racial stereotyping on top of it. Oh, they won't work. Add the lack of, one of the things too that we say, if you look at the Bahamas is a country that is, I don't know what the percentages are, but at the time, it is a majority African descended, majority formerly enslaved country, but also poorer whites. No one was saying, what will we do to make the, I'm not saying the governments now. I mean, please raise your hand if you can point to the Caribbean. And many Caribbean governments have had some moments where they said, let us do better. And all Caribbean governments have had some low moments. So one of industries kind of crop up, sometimes by accident, sometimes by global demand. We look at which industries cropped up as new ones for the Bahamas, as kind of boom and bust industries. And I use the term loosely, industries. Things like sponging, other kinds of agriculture. We had some, pretty good pineapple agriculture. But that didn't happen. And that was definitely shaped by most places were still colonized. These places, and this is one of the big, why were they poorer economies? They were no longer priorities. And it wasn't, so an inequitable system of colonialism had kind of left them in this place. And there wasn't this investment, the kind of investment in their either social or economic development. Like, no one was saying, what is the perfect way to ensure maximum thriving for most of the population in the post-emancipation Caribbean. So we had, and then to be fair, in the 1900s, you had different governments that tried in different ways. The development of tourism, we became in many places over-dependent on it, but it developed in part because they were looking for ways to develop economies.
Right.
All right.
Okay.
And one of the things that, while a lot of, if you have, for example, hotel corporations that are owned in other places or airlines or whatever, I'm not an economist, but you have are these industries circulating money and development in the local economy? They are, to the extent that they raise income, but then these kinds of trying to look for it is a relatively recent development. Something from about 1950 forward, where you had Caribbean governments seriously on a mission, successful, unsuccessful, to how can we, so that's the thing. If you look from 1850 to 1950, you had a century, not just of a lot of racialized discrimination and colonialism, but more the absence of a world in which that kind of planning, how do we spread income and success and thriving. And that's there's a comment in the chat about things that happened a long time ago, but these things create the economic structures. And there are, there's a bunch of articles out there that talks about how did we end up with a world where so much of the Caribbean, of Africa, of Latin America, lacks in wealth and development in ways of, say, Western Europe, or parts of North America. And it does date back to these time periods.
Oh, wait, did you freeze? No. All right, coming back.
Yeah. It is not, this is not simply a reparations conversation.
Right.
It is a question of saying, how did we get here? And, I find the 19th century, talking about the 1800s, it's positive. Ending slavery, a good thing. As we know in the Bahamas, a big chunk of, certainly my research expertise and a lot of my focus is on the Africans taken off of illegally operating slave ships. But they too were captives. So it's not like, and while people often talked, there was a lot of big talk, and we know this, when a ministry or a politician on a stump says, my plan is this, we hope, it may be that they're biting off more than they can chew. They're over promising. And so there was real discussion over, and there was a lot of expectation that, would these Africans do similar work to what enslaved people had done before? And that's the actual plan. No one said, like, what would it look like if we looked after our soil and looked back to some indigenous agriculture and had a subsistence plan? It's not quite what we did. We didn't start doing that until 100 years later.
And, and by you saying that, somebody just said to me about a week or two ago that it's not that, I said that we don't lack ideas and stuff, and they say, we have aspirations, but we just don't have plans and stuff. And so what you just said encapsulates that to me, because what it's basically saying, this is where our lack of structure probably came from, in terms of not following through to the things that really bring success, because we didn't have that example to do it, to follow it. And so, so this one question here is, what role did the religion play in the lives of enslaved people and the abolition movement, particularly in the Caribbean?
I love this question. I would say there's one truly negative role. One of the people I read a lot is an American bishop named Bishop John Spong. SPG.
Okay.
And he says that, and let's be clear, he's a Christian bishop. He said, my job is I know God through Jesus. This is my role. It is my religion. One of my duties is to teach that to people as a pathway to God. But one of my other jobs is to be very humble about other people's religious beliefs. All right. My job is not, is not to decide that, and I'm not going to get into a strict discussion. But he said, my job is to be humble about trying to understand, if I encounter you, an Igbo man, do you have a thought about God? How do you access God? And how does the God you know, and what the God guides you, and how you should be in the world? And he said that one of the things that frustrated him, and he passed away not so recently, but he said, we have all this information. One of the bad things, I would say, or one of the consequences of the way religion came with colonialism, is that there was, and it was, we have in the Bahamas, we acknowledge ourselves as a nation in which
don't stop talking, keep going.
The majority of population are Christian. But that is not the case that we view ourselves as necessarily imposing Christianity on anyone who shows up. One of my most beautiful experience, and I would be partisan and lift up QC, is we had which is a Methodist school. We had a student whose parents worked in the Bahamas for a short time, and he attended, but his parents did not like organized religion, and so they arranged for him to study in the library and do his homework, so that he wouldn't be forced to partake in our Methodist religious studies, because his parents felt strongly that they didn't like organized religion, not God. They didn't
Right.
like, and so QC and that's one of the things that the colonizers didn't do. They were not adapting, so they were like, "Here's our Christianity. It is right." And one of the, and then they would use it. It wasn't the reason they explored or conquered, but they then used it. They spread it, and indigenous people and African people, they took it. They learned God through it. They liked it. They did their own things with it, and it became an important part of the fabric of both African descended, indigenous, multiracial society. But that was at the expense of
Right.
recognizing and remembering the seriousness of the religious beliefs of the Africans who came,
Right.
and of the indigenous people, and so we live in the Caribbean. When you look around, you see a lot of people of African descent who don't know and haven't been in a society where they are encouraged to think a lot about what the religious beliefs of those of their African past. And one of the things that many of us know, because we certainly have a significant African immigrant population in the Bahamas now and in other parts of the Caribbean, we all know people who've had, say, their Christian marital ceremony, and then a marital ceremony also in the tradition of whatever African community and
They
spiritual
came from.
practice they
Right.
came from. And so these things, are not at war, but one of the consequences of Christianity being hand in hand with colonialism is that it did become sort of part of that system. The question about abolition, and the other thing that I do really like about it, is a lot of the Protestant churches that rose in, particularly the English colonized Caribbean, they were interested. They arose at a point when people said, look, a lot of Protestant religions we want to give more voice to the people. We don't want the clergy to dominate everything. We don't want, it's not that clergy dominated, because the other thing people need to remember is that there was folk and popular Catholicism. It's not like anyone in Spain was telling every peasant, this is exactly how you will believe in God, and I will come to your house and check. No. But they also really emphasized that everybody could come to God, could have voice, and it became a space in which people of African descent, even enslaved people, were encouraged to have their own voices, have their own spaces. And some of the most fun things I've read as a historian is for example, there's a missionary. You can go see he's got tombstones at Mount Carey in
Canada?
yeah.
Oh, okay.
Daniel Wilshire. He had good relationships with people. Like, they would say, I'm trying to do my best as a hard worker, but I'm underpaid. Can you lend me a shilling? All right. So they would try to, and he kept those notes there they're somewhere in Oxford now.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that and this is what's wrong with a WhatsApp. Because if you send your pastor a WhatsApp now, say, if I could borrow $20 till Friday, a historian in the future will not have that note. All right. So, but they built real relationships with people. And there was a man I encountered in Jamaica, and someone had stolen his hat. And he's like, I'm enslaved. I want my hat back. But in this society, I don't have any power. And so he went to the missionary and he said, can you help me get my hat back? And the missionary was not trying to abolish slavery, but he was like, I think I can help you with that, because I'm I'm not, and I don't know even if it was another black person or a white person. I don't know the circumstance, but they became, in many cases, allies. Sometimes they did become abolitionist allies. And there is there's a missionary, for example, in Guyana, a man named John Smith. One of my mentors, and this is also how I want to remember. I want people in the Bahamas to both look out and in.
Right.
One of my mentors was a Brazilian historian who studied 19th century Brazil, and Brazil becomes independent in the 1800s. Slavery ends, but then she's looking around and she says, "What else is going on in this time period? How are people criticizing slavery? What are they thinking about the future?" And she writes a book about a massive slave rebellion in what is now Guyana. And there's a missionary there, John Smith, who is Baptist. And the colonial government, they locked him up. They said, "You've been encouraging these enslaved people." Colonizers are always surprised when the exploited are angry. And they're like, who put you up to this? I'm like, who put you up to this? No, it's remarkable. And so in that sense, there was good and bad to it, but they became, and if you look not just in these Protestant spaces, but if you go to parts of Latin America, go to Brazil, everybody save your pennies and see the Roman Catholic societies. They have these brotherhoods and sisterhoods where they were allowed because of the religion to form an organization, and it allowed people to have a rich life. And I can see the question about Pan-African journey. I love those questions because often in those spaces, they were very African spaces, especially in places where the African born. And there is, for example, big talk in parts of Latin America about, how to communicate with Africans. And there's a book came out a couple of years ago about the efforts to translate Roman Catholic catechism into certainly Congo, Central African languages, and they were real discussions. And several of us who work on, and my work covers both history in the Bahamas and other areas, but several of us, note that it is mostly Yoruba who were among the founders of what is now Wesley Methodist Church. And I think one of the missionaries said, and someone, don't not quote me on this, it's been many years since I looked at his notes, that, these Yoruba speakers need to be sure that they don't, this is not just their church. But, and the things, I think the other thing that, where I say the church wasn't very progressive or very open-minded, the African population was notorious for being able to do the both and not, while there certainly were, and a woman I interviewed when I was a student at the University of West Indies in Trinidad.
Right.
She was an elderly woman then, and I was asking her some of the same questions we're talking about tonight. And she belonged, I think, to the Church of God of Prophecy. And she said, I think, at some time we just arrive at Jesus' time and we moved on from the other things. And that was her words. We arrived at Jesus' time. And I thought it was a nice way of putting it. But many people retained a both and very, as I said, like most of us know many, at least many, maybe a big statement. We've encountered people from West African societies who are Muslim or Christian or something else, and also continue with their with various traditional religious practices and do not see those things as being in conflict. Okay. So I think that there has been, we underestimate and should talk more about how we came from a colonial system that disrespected the contributions of Africans, of ordinary Africans, the most ordinary person, not a king or a queen, had a language and a culture. But we don't have to. We are free now. We can study.
Right. And that's why I'm not in favor of going to republic, right? Because I don't see where that's any better than what we have. We need to create our own. So we need to study and then create our own system. So what impact did the Pan-African journey have on the development of Caribbean societies and African diaspora?
Oh, so much. Beyond the foundation of so much of what we call Caribbean culture now is about, it has many contributions, but the African contribution is enormous. And so not just in things like Junkanoo, the way that our music has evolved, the way that our speech has evolved, but also the way, sometimes if you go
so they're the common ones that everybody always talk about, but what about business? How did it impact business?
I do think I was getting there, because the other thing, not at all, but so we have that cultural foundation, and then you have in the 1800s a lot of Black thinkers. They look around and they say, what do we as African thinkers have? We've all encountered colonialism, some through European slave trading in Africa, Africans in Africa, other forms of European incursion. Someone said that if you stretch a long tape of African history, the time of the Atlantic slave trade is just about the width of a hair. But long sweep. But even if you look since in the past 500 years, in the 1800s, especially late 1700s, you had African thinkers who said, okay, we're all encountering this colonialism. In what ways can we think together about this, and about both thinking about African leadership, thinking about essentially looking at some of these development questions? And it's taken, I would say it's taken at least kind of three big forms. One is that there are genuine, interesting Pan-African discussions about ending colonialism, ending its legacies. I say that the Caribbean punches above its weight. We are small populations, but if you want to look at sort of big thinkers, you look at a person like C.L.R. James, or if you look at and later in the 20th century, numerous novelists like Paul Marshall, thinking about these African diaspora questions. Virtually all of us who were in college in the 1980s had to read about the travels of Mrs. Mary Seacole in Many Lands, a woman of Jamaican ancestry. They are looking at colonialism and saying, how can we put our heads together and critique it and build something new? A lot of that, much like many of us may have learned about the attempts to form a Caribbean federation, a lot of these discussions fueled the individual independence journeys of places that became independent nations on their own. Then you had a different kind of Pan-African development where you often had, and some of this had to do with imperial powers moving people around. Like, I think if I'm the British Empire, I can bring, a doctor, lawyer, an administrator, a clerk from one part of the empire to the other. Or, there's a lot of talk now about international peacekeeping and support for creating some economic and civil society stability in Haiti, and talking about this is an international multi-part. But within the empire, you had moving people around, whether that be in different parts of the Caribbean. So like a person from Barbados brought into the Bahamas as a police officer because someone in Barbados said this person is good at in a mostly Black society in this way. So you had that kind of movement that was more within empire. But you then also had these voluntary movements from different parts of both Pan-African, but also if you look at a lot of the South Asian and Southeast Asian populations that were also brought as forced migrants, that then in the 1900s would sometime come to these sort of Caribbean and African places, and we would move around our places outside of North America and Europe amongst ourselves, and recognizing both populations that interest us because they're kind of like sort of meeting your second cousins or something.
Okay.
But also thinking about a shared history of trying to critique colonialism, thinking about what it means that the way that the world system developed was in this era of exploitation. And I emphasize this is not always, it's certainly not about shaking your fist at any individual person, but it is sometimes about shaking your fist about the successor governments and saying, how did this get this way? And those of you that benefited from it being this way have some duty to try to clean it up. But the other thing that is so that's kind of an earlier discussion. We are now in an interesting Pan-African moment, looking at how can we in the Caribbean, how can nations in Africa, can we build our own, instead of looking just sort of into North America or into Europe,
Right.
what do bilateral relationships look like?
Right.
And that's why I also like your thought. There are strong arguments in favor of a republic. There are strong arguments, but there's no argument that that's going to be the cure-all.
Right.
And a lot of the socioeconomic and political problems that we have in the republic isn't going to cure that. And maybe thinking, what are governmental structures? What are ways of doing things that might look different?
Right.
And I know that it's very challenging because small economies in the Caribbean, large but resource limited economies on the African continent, any government, all right, has a real challenge. What can I do to get the liquid capital that today will make sure that the school that just flooded may not flood next year, or that
Right.
we repair X, Y, and Z, and the balancing of the short, medium, and long-term goals, but thinking about these South-South partnerships and our Pan-African partnerships as a part of not just, as you said, the cultural ones that we all rightly enjoy and know well, but thinking about, and I also think that those economic, particularly economic and socioeconomic partnerships become also the path of getting us, we can't go back to 740 and have, some French or British colonizers say, you know what, I'm going to nurture both Igbo language and learning of French or English. We're all going to be multicultural together. We can't go back and have that conversation. We can think about and the other thing that I would say, we can be very careful not to take in the cultural stereotypes. We don't like cultural stereotypes about the Caribbean, and likewise, they're endless about Africa. And I don't know if it's a channel or a thing you subscribe to called Kweli TV, KWELI.
Don't know it.
Yeah. And like if people put it in a search engine on the internet and look, but they try to do programming. It's a little bit like some people will have seen on cable, the Africa channel.
Right.
Just get to know these partnerships and these places that some of them are places from which our ancestors actually came, if they're in West Africa and West Central Africa, but also get to know places elsewhere on the African continent that share some of this colonial history.
Right. And so you mentioned that, and I think somebody might have mentioned in the comments already, but I just had a conversation with some younger people than me, because I'm dead young.
Exactly.
But, we were talking about understanding life backwards, but you're living it forward, right? And what you were talking about just now, Chris Davis was on the show a couple of times, and on one of the times when he was on the show, he talked about the trade that existed between Ghana and the Bahamas and the Caribbean way back when. Not the slave trade, but regular trade. And with John Quan, what we call John Canoe kind of thing, and those. And so, yeah, if we understand how they were doing it back then, before the Pan American slave trade, then maybe we could learn some things from that to do what we doing now or trying to put in place again now in a better light, right?
Yeah, I would say. I mean, that the volume. I don't want. I mean, that's his expertise, not mine.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I will say that the thing that with the 19th century, to look back on earlier, I tell people. People often say, you know, you're being awfully calm about fill in the blank, and you know, there's two explanations.
Mm-hmm.
One, as you well know, I'm a middle child of 3
Mm-hmm.
people. So the C in the middle is often, so the psychologist will say, your calmness is explained by that. The historian in me says, I study the era of slavery. And so I see people every day in my work who had an enormous obstacle set against them. They lived in a society that, as I said, either enslaved them or didn't have particularly ambitious plans for their thriving. All right. And to watch them come up with plans of various kinds for their own thriving, for their own relationships, and to think through their lives in ways way bigger than what seemed particularly possible.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the challenge. There's a pretty famous, and it's a reference to a white abolitionist, but there's a documentary, a U.S. documentary called something like The Abolitionists. And they talked about what it meant. All enslaved people, all right, you know, look at something. If an enslaved person thinks either I know I can escape,
Mm-hmm.
all right, the whole society is up against you. Very small numbers of people fled. All right. But if we get ourselves organized, you know, I wish we can talk about Pompey Square, but think about what an actual slave rebellion is. And I think we're sometimes reluctant to do it because people think it's, oh, you're going to bring up racial hatred, or and I said, you know, that is it is our history, and by not talking about it,
right, it gets suppressed.
You're doing a disservice. This is not about every single person, whether including the ones I disagree with and who do not think highly of me, are entitled to be treated with dignity and respect,
Right.
and to be considered for their own actions. All right. But to look at the people that would say in the 1800s, if we get ourselves organized, we can overthrow this society that oppresses us. And I'm not arguing for anything to be overthrown, but that's an ambitious goal.
Right.
All right. And to think outside the box, to not say we have never had X, or
Right.
I tell the example. If we say, oh, one of the examples, if I can't imagine a Bahamas with radically less dependence on North American tourism and robust agriculture and 40% of the population living in Eleuthera Exuma on Long Island. I can't imagine it.
Right.
And you know, part of our job as citizens is to imagine it. If enslaved people can imagine a life without slavery in a society that's more just,
Right.
look at something like it's easy to look at the Haitian Revolution and just focus on the fact that it overthrew both slavery and colonialism, and what is now Haiti. That's an ambitious goal. All right. Now, I think we kind of talk about it like, okay, that's a historical fact. Yes, that's a historical fact, but it is people having it is people having a big goal, bigger than what was
Right.
known to them.
But we have to build our own in each generation, and I think we're down to about 4 or 5 now since majority rule, and our own visions as to what we may not have or felt that could have happened during our generation, but that we need to make or strive towards. When we talk about this question here, where we say, can you highlight some specific Bahamian or Caribbean heroes, etc.? Well, your dados were a part of a movement that made that vision to be able to say, okay, well, we got to think bigger than what we were to move forward,
And I said that is the thing, that one of the things, and this is not a politically partisan statement, all right? Because the people, the men and women that wrote the end of colonialism in the Bahamas, that imagined it, Daddy used to always say that one of the things that was amazing is that we would get up and say we had these ideas about ending colonialism and about expanding education seriously to the masses of population, to getting everybody better wages. And he said to me, he would say, sweetheart, and they believed us. And that is, he says, that's pretty amazing. Right? And he said that when you look back at what we were up against, all right, and then to say to people, I fancy myself as a political leader or a leader of any kind, and I have an idea that we will have an idea of universal open access education, that we have an idea of women voting, all right? That these are absolutely these were absolutely enormous goals. But that's why I like looking. I often say to my students, both in the United States and Caribbean-based students, I said, you want to think about in 1830, all right, in 1830, slavery had ended in Haiti. All right, it had ended in some other parts of the region, in parts of Latin America and parts of North America, what is now the United States, around independence. But it was still running over the Caribbean. There were conversations going on, to be sure, about its end at that point. But if you look 50 years later, except for Brazil, the end is written. And said, what dream? Like, so when we say, if Chris Davis and I say, no, really, 50 years from now, the Caribbean will have as much trade with Africa as with North America.
Right.
People can say, oh, come on.
Yeah.
All right. But in fact, that is one of the reasons I really like the 19th century, because emancipation wasn't something, it wasn't easy. It wasn't inevitable. It was something that people talked about for a very long time before it happened. I tell people all the time, I often count, I said, when I look back, like what's going to be on my top 25 list of great days. All right. The one that is going to be on that list, and it's going to be hard to push it off. All right. Is when we made Kate Moss a national hero, that decision. Okay. Take this enslaved girl. And I know that both the committee and Dr. Ian Strawn's novel and the voice in that, but a country that says that both an ordinary and extraordinary young girl suffered this incredible abuse, all right, endured this incredible abuse as a part of the most radical transformation in Caribbean history, to look around for her name, all right, in terms of, we can talk a lot about some, I mentioned Pompeii, there's great biographies of other sort of anti-slavery leaders around the Caribbean. that we should pay attention to, whether it be a figure. There's a couple of new biographies that have come out. Like I think in 1 year, new biographies came out of Nanny of the Maroons in Jamaica. That to think about, to think outside of our normal boxes, as it were, for what we look at as heroic, to look for it in the everyday. And that's the other thing that I would say is to think about is both. We don't celebrate Kate Moss because we're sort of celebrating suffering. She was not she individually. She was a part of a community of people who endured much and sought and envisioned better, and exactly, and had those big ideas. And that's one of the things that I really want us to look at the 19th century in that way. To think about, it was an incredibly transformative era. That instead of being afraid to talk about slavery and its end, is not just to sort of celebrate the things about our culture that we understand as African, and also to be aware of the parts of our culture that we know came from British colonialism. I do think that we need to be more open to talking about it. I tell people all the time, I tell people that I want to think of myself as a Black nationalist who happens to love cricket and tea. What does that mean? I can be all of these things. Who wishes I knew more Yoruba. There were some men in the prison here who decided, I don't know what, doing all this time, they made themselves an African language club. An African language club. They are in jail.
Right.
All right. And so they say, you know what? To understand more of our history, all right, we have time on our hands. One of the things we would like to do for some months. Someone told me that, and I said, "You joking?" And you could order, like, you can request, books. And they said, "Can we get?" I think it was Yoruba language books. So study so that we don't understand. We talk a lot about African roots of culture. And I do think that one of the legacies of slavery is that the slavery that we had in the Caribbean and in the Bahamas was racial. And the idea that that there's something wrong with Black people, that there's something wrong with Africans, that they are lesser beings, or that they are suitable for certain kinds of physical tasks. One of the things that people forget, I have one of my colleagues here, a British historian. She teaches a class on, I think, violence and torture in early England. And she says, people of all backgrounds did all kinds of work, suffered all kinds of abuse. And we are descended in the Caribbean, majority populations, from African people who were enslaved. Still running around in our society are ideas about Black people that come from that time. And, one of the things I admire a lot of younger, newer scholars about, anti-Blackness is real. All right. And the idea, if someone, I have a friend who is a lawyer in North Carolina, and he says, if I as a 35-year-old white lawyer in North Carolina, I'm lazy at my job. When I was a student, I met him when he was a student in New Orleans. If I didn't go to my class, no one assumed that white people from North Carolina were deficient. All right, because there's no history of hundreds of years of white people from North Carolina being put under this, and we still, though that long history, still affects and shit. And around it, like, racism wasn't the reason for slavery or colonialism, but it developed as a part of the justification. It is in someone I heard and I'm going to get the name wrong because there's two brothers with similar names. One is a history professor, the other is a congressman in Florida. I think it's Dr. Hassan Jeffries. And he said that, we're still in a society that teaches people that all of the messaging is to have less empathy for people who are not European. and to
Okay.
assume, is it something about them as opposed to, and it's, he said, and he told, I heard him give a talk where he says that we teach empathy, we teach cultural understanding, we message,
Mm-hmm.
when we say that it's not, and I think, color blindness is nonsense. All right, that's saying I will erase who
But
in
do we
order.
practice that though? We teach it, but do we practice it? Because
Yeah.
we still in this mode where we have parents who still think that the idea where we say children are to be spoken to and so forth, and all of these old colonial, I call them colonial, they might not
Yes.
be colonial things, but that were taught for keep us at bay or to keep us disciplined in our life so we don't be rebellious. Those things that that's that's not embracing individualism or creativity and stuff like that. That's kingdomship or
Yes,
the
very,
norm.
very much so. And
Mm.
we have inherited, like, one of the uh last time we had an election, I can't remember when it was. I started making a list of books. I think everybody, like, like, I'm not to interfere with the party's rights to choose their own candidates. But I said, before you run for office, you should have to read. And I had a couple of books.
Oh,
And one of
gee.
them was a book about, yes, and yeah, here's the, yeah,
I'll never run then.
have you finished your homework before you can put your name in to be the candidate for, I just forget where, if, let's say I come on, I think I'd still be in Kalani. Before you
Mm.
could be the candidate for Kalani, you have to read these 3 books. And one of them, there's a book of essays that was just about what did it mean to be in these and they were essays about post-colonial places.
Okay.
And one of the things, to what you said, that these ideas of hierarchy and control that come, not just that they are legacies of us. As I said, after emancipation, it's not like everyone said, let's get together and think about the best way everybody can thrive.
Right.
Same thing. We've not only inherited racial ideas, we've inherited ideas about hierarchy and control. One of the things that's going on in the United States right now, and uh, I love one of my mentors, Father Willie Thompson, was said, you can both
Godfather.
yeah, you could serve the Israelites quite well in Pharaoh's house. You also learn many things in Pharaoh's house, where I choose to live. And one of the things going on right now in education is that they're saying, what would it mean to be truly decolonial? To
Oh, boy.
actually, yeah, decolonial. All right. What does it mean to be truly decolonial? Not to just talk about a republic, but to actually say what hierarchies, what ideas about ourselves, what ideas about the world came out of those long years, all right, of colonialism. What would it mean to actually say, I'm going to be decolonial? I'm going to think not just about no more slavery. Like, there was around independence, there was a lot of comparing of colonizers to slave masters and all of this thing. But what to really get to the root? Like, we have an opportunity every summer. People, you want to make teachers vex? Tell them they have summers off. Like, somehow, like, they just walk into the classroom and magically the lesson plan already, just someone else grew it over the summer. Magic.
Yeah.
I have an opportunity every summer now to take a workshop. If I'm not engaged in something else, summer school teaching or research, on what would it mean to teach in a decolonial way. Like, are there ways that the book is structured that still, and that's what you are talking about, like the way we parent, the way we speak to one another, the way we think about any long list of things, that it's not just about not having anti-Black racism, not looking down on non-European cultures. It's much more, it's like, what are these ideas about hierarchy and control and discipline, and what, like, people say in all of these questions about, like, policing, like, look at 1,000 years of history, and how did societies have social control? What did they do? What worked? What didn't work? Instead of assuming that these structures that came from, as I said, these were not systems that said, let's maximize human thriving. where to really be serious about saying that we are, one of the things they taught us, the population of the Bahamas now is what, 410,000, but I think that's still counting me. We count the diaspora and we get these numbers. But our teachers used to tell us that there's 250,000 of you. You better look outwards, because everyone, living, you gotta, both because you're small and there's a big wide world out there. You should learn. You are a part of it. And I tell, even, in the United States, this gigantic country of 330 million people. Yeah. I said, all the good ideas in the world are not here. All right. And we really, what would it mean to really say, I want everybody to thrive? What would a world system look like in which we really encourage that? But also, what would a system for us in the Caribbean, for us in the Bahamas, what would it look like to say, I'm just as interested in African history as North American or European history. I'm just as interested in sort of what non-European, non-North American cultures look like and might have to teach us, but also to really look at ourselves and say what things, if there's, as I said when we discussed the question about Christianity, all right, if African people who were enslaved, all right, could say, what if this Christianity takes me to God and takes me in a good place? They didn't say, I will do this exactly the way you did it.
Right.
I will find ways to think about, to reinterpret, because I'm seeking something. If we applied that to all areas of our lives and not treat the structures we've inherited as if they're somehow so precious that we must never get rid of them.
Right.
And that a decolonial, not just a post-colonial Bahamas, but a decolonial.
Yeah. And
colonial.
And that same point, that when I talk with some people and they talk about when you could hear it coming out and say, oh, well, I went to this school and I went to that school and I got educated, so that means that they are in essence entitled. But I always say, those who might not have gone to school is more influenced by the old colonial systems that you just talked about, and how those ways of doing things are instilled in us still to this day. People say, and we're still talking about the Bahamian language is not a language, it's a dialect. And I have a number of scholars who tell me to the contrary, that it is a language. It just was adopted when the English came this way. And so when we look at this major question that I think speaks to what is holding back the Bahamas and maybe the Caribbean from maximizing its potential. So I don't think we are no more than 10% of our potential that we're doing today. And that is to speak to this word of entitlement, that we seem to, when we get either in a position of authority or have a title or whatever it is, that we are entitled and nobody else can either tell us differently or what have you. Did that come from the slave process?
I don't think so. I think,
okay.
I think, and I'm a historian, not a sociologist. If I knew what a sociologist was when I was in school, I would be a sociologist. But I would say, I think one of the things it comes from is that we are, and many post-colonial societies find themselves in this place. That I said I have great sympathy for governments, not because I'm the child of someone who worked high in government and had to make certain kinds of decisions. Someone I saw every day. All right. These are hard decisions. Right. I think that sense of entitlement comes from a similar place. I look around, I see a society where for hundreds of years, structures have made it hard for people to get ahead, to advance, to be able to provide for their families, to feel some confidence about their children's futures, to feel some confidence of that the future will be better for their next generations. So that when they put work into improving themselves, part of it is exactly that. They're like, man, I have fought back all these things, and
Mm-hmm.
I make sure that nothing pushes back or pushes me back down. All right. And I think I have sympathy for where that comes from, because it
Okay.
comes from looking around and seeing, boy, I got this thing, and it's been so hard for a person like me, most people with my background, to get to this place. All right. And I think that the multi-generational challenges of getting the little bit of advancement
A big one.
then
Yeah.
then makes one very, more protective, defensive of it,
Mm.
and stepping back and saying, well, wait, can I protect what I have, all right, and what I have achieved, and still be very open to different paths, and is as opposed to, and I'm an optimist.
Mm-hmm.
I think we can uh I think we can try. I think we can try to do both things, but I do think that's another way that I think history can both serve us, but we really need to attend to it, because
Mm.
I say to a very wise student of mine once said to me, he said, Professor, I was thinking, in my family, good, yes. Anyone listening who is a college student, or a parent of a college student, do a little bit of the reading and think. You don't even have to finish it all. I would be happy if you finished it all. But he said, I was thinking, and he said he counted back. And he said in his family, he could count back, I think, 7 generations
Mm.
who had access to go to university. That
Mm-hmm.
if they wanted, whoever the parents, the family who was doing the raising of
Right.
young people, he said 7 generations. I could look back, and every household, they were different levels of wealth, and he was by no means poor, but you wouldn't have call him the super
Right.
rich. You weren't going to see, this is not a Kardashian home. Um, he said, but I could count 7 generations when we could say, if we want to advance, we could send not only through schooling or in the home, if you go back, but we could send to some advanced education so they could advance in life. 7
Right.
generations. His neighbor, she was the first generation that had
Wow.
that access with some confidence.
Mm.
And I think, and he said that changes how you look at the world.
Mm.
And I do think that that's the other thing. And I think that that's one of the things that's going on when we look the world over, is that we get a lot of information now through the internet about what thriving looks like, what access is, and many, many more people in the Caribbean have that kind of access.
Mm-hmm.
Now, and I think people become protective of it and anxious that it can be taken away, and or that the opportunity, and it's tricky in terms of
Mm.
thinking about getting people to feel, creating enough economic and social security, small s, so that people can continue to think. And I said I'm always amazed at the enslaved who could see, um, who could imagine something different.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm likewise, I'm not going to pat elites on the head, like all kinds of people, from working class backgrounds who didn't have security, but nevertheless said that I will devote my effort to increasing the number of people who can advance even a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things that U.S. and Cold War anti-communist politics got us was, oh my gosh, anything that is, we developed sort of political
Right.
fear about ideas, and so I do think that that sort of entitlement that I've worked very hard, and I'm going to protect what, you will not take this away from me,
Mm.
is, I think it comes from that place of
Mm.
essentially, and I want us to think about more, what would more community mindedness look like, what would more security look like? I think one of the reasons I tell people I wake up in the morning, lucky me, and I think about how did enslaved people think about the world? What did they want about their communities? That's what I get paid to do. And people both around both the ending of slavery,
Right.
and that's the other thing that I think that we want to do in the Caribbean. It's like how does a person with who has with their first job in say an administrative position or assisting in a shop, how do they see the world? What opportunities do they need? And I do think that one of the things that is I like this program that we can maximize use of these internet tools, make access to both the past and to ideas more accessible to more people outside of the formal classroom, because you need to get citizens ready. I'm a fan of structured education so that we can walk through, so that we at least walk out the door at 16 or at 18 with a basic understanding of the world around.
Right.
Then to be, and I would say one of the things that worries me, not just because I like reading historical stories, I like reading all kinds of stories, but I do think we don't want to, the internet has a kind of look it up culture. Like, well, if I want to know this, I can literally with my phone. All right. If I am on some Wi-Fi or have some data, I can look up X. But I think you want to sort of, how can you keep busy listening and reading so that hey, I wonder how, I don't know, how sort of women leaders function in Central Africa. There's another one, Queen Nzinga of what is now sort of the Congo and Angola regions of Africa. She has a couple of biographies, or even I read right now. I read how do you say, like Scandinavian detective fiction, just because I'm curious, like what are the way they what do they talk about, like one of the things they said, they wanted the police to be more supportive of little small craft clubs so that they felt a part of civic community. And apparently I said, what is that, societies where people have knitting clubs or whatever, that I always tell people that we there's a thing on Netflix now called Join or Die, about how good belonging to some little club is for is for your mental, not just your mental health, but like it could lower your blood pressure apparently. That's, I think, so many I think part of the reason, and this is getting away from the history, the Bahamas is certainly a society where huge numbers of people belong to, say, church associations and civic associations. And that is, they say there's all this data now that helps you fight your high blood pressure. Now, I'm not saying people should exercise more, walk more, drink more water.
Right.
And, as I tell people all the time, more or less do what your doctor told you to do. They are probably right. They went to school for that. But I think it's one of the things that's actually allowing us to have our health, our lifestyles are having some consequences for us. And that's partly because we're also being, one of my obsessions is what choices are being made for us by what we eat by people outside of the Bahamas. And one of the most horrible things I read was when fast food companies said, well, literally they would say, well, gosh, if these people in North America figure us out and say that we should probably eat less of this, how can we keep producing this? Instead of saying maybe we should produce less of this stuff, it's only supposed to be an occasional treat, they say, who else we can find to eat this? And I said, no.
Back when I guess America shut down the tobacco companies in a way.
Yeah.
It is said that they just migrated from that industry into the cookie business, I call it a cookie business, the sweets
Yeah.
business,
Yeah.
and they went the trans fats and the rest of it. So it's the same type of addiction being had, etc. and so forth.
And that's what when people always say to me, they said, "Well, don't compare me to a slave trader." And I said, I'm not comparing. The same thing I said at the start. When you look at the way decisions were made about the slave trade, I want more of us. All right, and especially young people that go into the United States or go into Europe and take a course in a business school, and they teach you things about marketing. All right. And if someone is sitting in a room and saying, if we put this chemical in this cookie, someone will eat 3 of it.
Right.
And I said, is that no, if you want to, is that harmful to that person? Like you want to, it is, first do no harm. Like, what is this? I'm not saying if you wish to sell, can you make enough money selling enough cookies, or do you need to sell some other things, as opposed to let us come up with ways to make this thing, the things that may be deadly and harmful. You actually have to, one of the things, likewise, I don't believe in private electric corporations. So one of the things I say to I think these things are public necessities, and I believe they should be well run, but run by the public. But one of the things, we're constantly having fights here that people in the Bahamas would be familiar with. And the electric company will say, the last hurricane was very expensive. We must raise your rates. And I said, well, it was very expensive for everyone. Supposing you lower your profit a little bit and raise my rate a little bit. That instead of having the conversation, and people will say, I'm a corporation. My job is to make a bunch of money. And I said, yes, but that doesn't mean you must do that without one thought for the common good. All right. And the common good standard, whether you are a small shopkeeper, all right, the person making the decisions for the Bahamian economy, all right, or the person at the IMF, like everybody, like, or even the insurance business is global warming. So we can live through, more kind of damage and disaster than we did 10 years ago. That means that if in insurance you used to make X profit, maybe you have to make less profit, because it is not tenable to just, and people will say, oh, if you do this, if you regulate this industry, the company will pass it on to the consumer. I said, that's not science, that's a choice. The same thing, like, one of the things that I study the 19th century, which is where we started, which is when people decided not for it was a combination of factors. And a whole system of racial slavery ended, and they did not come up with a beautiful social revolution, perfect, all right, that would make it, but they did radically change a way of doing things, that they had done this thing that way, and versions of that way for hundreds of years. And then they stopped doing it that way. And in countries where the majority of us are the descendants of people that saw that change, we should raise our hands and say, if I want to see radical change and believe that a radically better future is what I want, whether that means standing up to a global import market around food and saying, one of my dreams for the Bahamas, looking particularly at our health indicators, I would like someone to say the same way in my field, I'm working on a fun book now. I will say it out loud. It's not fun because it's sad and there's slavery. And, people in the Bahamas, when we talk about liberated Africans, we talk about them coming off of slave ships. They were on slave ships. That's bad. But one of the things I'm trying to think about in this new book is how they thought about their own lives and what little things they wanted. Not the big things, what little things they wanted. And it is... there was a question there about historians and the telling about the lives of the enslaved. One of the reasons we're super lucky, I consider myself very lucky to live at the moment that I live, is you have to kind of attack both the archives and the past with some imagination and the when I find a publisher and they shake their fist and say, "No, you cannot call your book that." Um, I want to call the book Aduma's Colonial Archive. And Aduma is a woman, that's a her Igbo name down in Exuma. And I said, you know, the archive is hers. It don't belong to the government. And we must think about I want us to be the same way that you look at the 19th century and look at ordinary people and what they want. We are capable of shaking our fist at these huge global economic forces and say, you know what? If I had, you know, we in the Bahamas, we are standing up and saying, the same way our ancestors in the 19th century saw radical change, we wish to see a radical change in the way import structures, you know, put things that we shouldn't be consuming at a higher rate in our economy. All right. I tell, you know, Daddy used to say all the time, so this is not an original thought. He said, you know, the Bahamas, we small, you know, we can try almost anything. You remember my favorite Bahamian story these days? I tell people in the United States this all the time. You remember when everybody thought not having plastic bags in a food store? Oh God, it was the end of the world. And then the pandemic happened. And we're like, I see. This is a large problem. So that part, and we can argue about the, you know, it is actually much bigger changes that will change the environment. I still am in favor of the ending of the plastic bags.
But it's a struggle for the people who want to go back and don't make progress forward.
If I say, you know, we are, you know, every time we see like those health indicators or the economic indicators, we say, oh gosh, what can we do? I said, I studied the century that saw changes that were unthinkable. So imagine, I don't think it's at all impossible. All right. And it doesn't require dictatorship or coercion. It requires vision. Like, I do not think it is impossible to say that the kinds of things economically and socially that are doing us harm, that which of them can be changed and how can we stand up and change it? And we saw the ending of slavery. I studied the ending of slavery. That's the 19th century. We saw the end of colonialism. Like, I forget there's some teeny tiny number of places that how do you call it? That British colonialism did not touch. We saw it end. We saw it end. All right, you know.
Haile Selassie from Ethiopia, I think is one.
Yeah. So it's, you know, and in that sense, we have I think we want to have that kind of vision, both about, you know, sort of things that seem insurmountable. All right. You know, like we look at the amount of violence we see in our society that comes out of frustration where our young people are. Like I keep, we were just about with the, I as I said, you know, my friend Dr. Ian Strawn says that I remain in New Orleans in part because I think I'm at home. You know, it is a lot of things. You know, we have about 400,000 people here. We have a high level of gun violence on the street because there's too many guns and young people are frustrated with their circumstances. So they end up shooting one another, or the amount of violence in our homes is in part because, as you said, we've inherited these hierarchical structures. But when people's when there are frustrations in one's external life, and this is not a justification, all right, homes should be places free of violence, end of story. That comes from certain kinds of places. I see in South Louisiana where I live, it is a post-colonial, post-slavery society with high levels of economic frustration. And, I in a second, like many people in the Bahamas, I will cut on the news here and pray that no one shot anyone else today, and that maybe there's been some good news out of our schools as opposed to some bad, and that we've made some kind of progress. And I forget whether we're in Domestic Violence Month or Mental Health Month or both. And I would say, like, that's one of the things that I think that the starting place on it is certainly education and community organizations. I do think that, when people talk about reparations, people get all like up in arms and stuff. And I said, I actually do think that some of the pathways to reparations involve actually uh, funding, putting direct money. There's a historian that everybody should read, Dr. Nikki Brown. She writes about women's political organizing, but also about like Black communities, and she's got a new book coming out about African descendant communities in Turkey. But she
Okay.
said, how about for reparations? We'll start by, the global North paying a big bill for mental health care, free mental health care, with like, and she said one of the good things about that is the worst thing that can happen, she said, if you said in the United States, supposing you said in the United States that every person who had at least one great 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 grandfather who was enslaved could get 4 mental health appointments once a quarter for free, that they got to sit down with a counselor or a psychologist. You didn't have to have any family trouble in your home. I know that, one of the things the Bahamas actually does better than the United States is the Department of Social Service will at least try, if they know there's trouble in a home, you must come in and sit with social service and have certain kinds of processes.
Conversation. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, like the United States, like, where's the money for that? I said, I come from a poorer country than you. But supposing you said that every individual was entitled to, and they could decide, do I want to do a family mental health thing? It's just free. And Dr. Brown says the worst thing that would happen, Dr. Nikki Brown, she says, the worst thing that would happen, if people said it was unfair to just give it to those people, then you'd give it to everybody. And that would not be bad either.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And she said, I do think we have to think creatively about, but I will also say, and I do think that that's the other thing, that when you mention like thinking outside of the box, not just thinking of
Right.
the public as being that's one of the things that there's a lot of economic study on, not just in reparations discussion, but in general, is the idea of, I don't know if the Bahamas has had discussion yet of this, not necessarily us doing it in the Bahamas, because it could come externally. One of the things out of these post-colonial, post-slavery reparations process is, what does universal basic income do, as opposed to waiting until people with serious socioeconomic challenges in their lives have even worse problems? Like, does it cost you more to say,
Right.
like, basic income is this, everybody gets it, so that, because it tends to prevent, and they're just now doing economic circumstances. We say, would we rather, Dr. Alison Rhyming and others have said this in the Bahamas for years. Like,
Mm-hmm.
would you rather spend money on after-school programming and psychological counseling, or on the prison? All right, what is your what's your pleasure? And I think and there is some discussion of sort of universal basic income as, yeah. And one of the things people, questions about art, about community organizations. One of the other things that, this is a wonderful conversation, but there's not a lot of 9-year-olds that are going to listen to something to think about yet. All right, some 14-year-olds should be listening. But one of the things about young people is they look around and they see that people who look Black, people who look like they might have descended from slavery, that they're looked down upon, that there's ideas in the world about them. There used to be a radio advertisement. I can never remember, someone who lives in 2 countries. I think it was in the US. And it had a child sitting down, and the little boy said, "Daddy, I hear very bad ideas about women and girls on the TV and on the radio. I would like to discuss how to treat them better." And the man said, "Your child is not coming to you to ask you that." Now, it is true that he is seeing very bad, dehumanizing, sexist, offensive, ungodly things, but he is not going to come and ask. The same thing is true about this history and historical trauma of slavery and racism. Well, children see it, they perceive it, they know it. They know that, they may read about slavery in BJCs, but there's not a lot of talk about its long-term consequences. And I do think this is one of the things that community organizations and art and churches can do more. People will often say, don't dwell in the past, you're blaming.
Right.
And I said, it's not an either or. It's not like, I'm a slavery historian and also an environmentalist and a prison reformer. And some days, I talk to priests every time in the Bahamas about talking about creation care in our churches. And like, it's one thing to say, God made the earth, therefore don't throw garbage out of your car on God's earth.
Right.
Take it home and dispose of it properly. That's like it's not an either or discussion. And one of the things that I think harms children is when we don't talk about things like this radio program said, that they see in this stuff, and they're not going to come to you and ask,
Right.
their minds aren't there yet. We have to be open and give them opportunities to engage with these ideas, to think about it. Like, they're not going to say, I don't see very many beautiful and interesting programs on the TV about schools and hospitals and politics and ordinary life in Africa. Could I please have some of that? Like, we can, they're not going to say it. They're going to get
Right.
the whole diet of and that's the thing that where I think, schools, likewise, they have a challenge. They have to get our young people where they are. God knows.
Yeah,
some
but
people will be
they're
nice.
not necessarily adapting to the technologies and stuff that is available. Because I know I when I was in a multi-marketing program, and they used to say you need to get wide to build depth, right? And basically, the way I see it is, at least the way I use the tools, is I would go on YouTube, etc., and I have an idea or something I want to research or study and stuff, and I will do a search on it, and a bunch of stuff will come up, and then I get a context, and then I now go off of that, off of ChatGPT, etc., and then I go and drill down in other sources to get the actual content that I want to enlighten myself on. Versus, because in the social media everybody has access, and that a lot is good and some is just for the garbage can kind of thing,
Yeah.
right? So
And one of the things I say, like, in thinking about 19th century history, about thinking, like I said, one of the things I like about studying the 19th century, there's a British government that, what colonizers were really good for? They out here, they took land from people didn't belong to them. They're busy exploiting people, and someone's making a lot of money, and all around them is suffering. Oh my God, but they will complain. And I was like, oh, poor you. And there's I forget which governor it was. He said, oh my goodness, this whole challenge with all these slave ships coming by here, and now it's abolished, and I have to handle all of this. And I was just like, and he said, my poor colony, I'm on the Turnpike Road to the slave markets of Cuba. Woe is me. Like, if you want, I say that to say, he's sort of crying about slave ships and his proximity to Cuba. I think everybody, poor Cuba with all its suffering now. I don't know if the current is back on there yet. But what you said about the internet and civic organizations, and one of the things, it is quite, I don't want to make more work for teachers and overburden people. And as I said, I have a lucky job. All right. Anytime if I was with mommy and daddy, and we would see someone, we said, oh, which one of your children is this? What does she do? And I would describe my job, and what I do. And it's not my, and I'm not sure how long we're due to be on, but like my students have mocking, they wish I would do. But and daddy would say, and I describe my job and my interest in history and how I get to both study it and research it and teach it. And he would look at whoever and he said, and they pay her to do this. It's what I do. But I don't want to make more work for people with but if you have a tiny bit of curiosity about Angola or the Democratic Republic of Congo, where roughly a third of all people, if you look around the United States, if you go in Miami and you're shopping, or you go to Jamaica and you're looking around, about a third of the people you see have ancestry in those parts of Central Africa. The same way Chris Davis will tell you. If nice if Chris Davis can educate you about Ghana, but you know what? With one of the things that internet resources give, that anyone in a vacation Bible school or in an after school program, you could, with a tiny bit of looking around, say, we could learn a little something about Ghana. All right, we can look up what languages they speak there, or we can look at how kente cloth is sewn or whatever, and you're gonna get. I would say this: it's very hard to there's so much out there, but keep it simple. All right, you can actually say, I'm not going to try to find some detail that someone might have exaggerated or might have gotten a little bit wrong, or might be trying to sell me something or get me to click to their website because there's something advertised there, and their advertisers, if you want, I tell my coworkers all the time, if you get sick or you have to pick up your child and you need me to teach a class for you, I'm just going to walk in there and teach the students how to memorize the map of Africa, because then they will learn something. All right. And most of us, you can keep it simple if you just, sort of know that, where Benin is in relation to Ghana. A key point, because I was stopped at the border once because someone wrote the date backwards. People write the date different order. And so they thought my passport had expired, and it had not. So I also spent some time in Benin, more time than I intended. A little bit of time I did spend, which was good. But you can do basic things. We should know more about Africa. I tell my students all the time, if someone graduates from St. Augustine College or the Bahamas, and they are not sure where Jamaica is on the map, or where the city of New York is, people can be like, what they taught you in that school? All right. And we paid fees for you to go to school, and you can't figure that out. All right. But if you can't find Accra in Ghana, or you can't find Lagos, or you can't find Kinshasa, they think less. And so we can make our baby steps, all right, about this history. And that's one of the things, and one of the hopes that there's a lot of historical research that now has digital components to it, and you can put more on the internet and make it accessible. And I'm just now thinking about how to do that. I do think that there are kind of ethical considerations in terms of both accessibility. Don't want both things do cost money, but you can't have everything behind a paywall. It's also a question. My students here ask me a question all the time, which is very pertinent in a place like the Bahamas and in much of the Caribbean. We're reliant on tourism for our economy, and there's nothing wrong with people wanting to rest and relax from their hard jobs on a lovely beach or whatever. But then how do you balance that, with a respectful consideration? I love where the Pompey Square and the museum are, but sort of how do you balance that? You want, public history is hard. I have for a whole term, and so we have a lot of time to think about what stories and how to do it. Whereas if you just have a short time that someone's gonna pass through your museum, and they also, my students here, they complain all the time. They say, I don't want nobody with no daiquiri and their disrespectful, jokey t-shirt coming through. There's a place here we call Congo Square, which is not unlike Congo Square. I don't want them in here. I want them in here with the right attitude. And I said, yes, I agree. But these societies are small and spaces are small. And so it is, it's tricky, but I think we can do it. And we have made progress. There was a time we can remember it. Many more than roughly a third of the Bahamian population can remember when the very idea of having a slavery museum in the center of Bay Street was not something that was considered obvious and natural. And now it is. And many people, the late Dr. Gail Saunders, chief among them. All right. Grace Turner and Chris Curry and all these people and others have done with the Monuments Commission, really tremendous, important work in changing the narrative, brick by brick. And I do think that's the other thing to remember. Things that were unthinkable, all right, are now thinkable. And that is the thing. There are ethical things. My students are right. If they
Right.
feel like, are you sober? What you drinking? Are you drinking a daiquiri in the slavery studies space? That doesn't feel right.
Yeah.
But we also, the urban planning, it's hard because the city grew up around, sites. Now there's a company here try to build a dirty plastics plant, and they found some graves of enslaved people there.
Oh, gee.
Yeah, and so it's complicated, but I think we can do it.
Yeah. So let's see if we could bring this all into perspective. Because you put a lot on the table tonight. So how can the future research in history of Atlantic slave trade contribute to the deeper understanding of our contemporary Caribbean societies, and particularly in the Bahamas? And you talk, and I'll be right back in 2 seconds.
I think that one of the things that I think, particularly thinking about the Atlantic slave trade, thinking about the history of slavery, it is now no longer excluded. But and this is going to sound like a contradictory thing to say, but I want to make it feel more ordinary. That we consider it normal and natural and obvious that we have a pirate museum in Nassau. We talk about pirates, and I love those
pirates.
Yeah, I love those students at UB who were like, "Oh God, I was so sick of the Lord's proprietors." First of all, because they didn't really understand what they were, and they seemed a little suspicious. Like, people's instincts are correct. They were like, "Who were those people, and why did they take up so much of that chapter?" They found them very suspect. I love their instinct, but I want it to become normal for people to say, "Oh, last names in the Bahamas are complicated because they come from the history of slavery." All right, because people will say to me often, they will say, like, "Oh, you related to this Adleys," and I said, I don't believe so by blood, but once you go back into slavery, then you had the name of someone either who actually owned you or some colonizer who you worked for, because thanks to anyone who's read a little bit about of things that my sort of biography history comes out of, as I said, these the liberated Africans, they weren't slave ships, they were enslaved. Like, they were special, and as someone who's made a career writing about them, I think they're very special. No one, I've spent 30 years of my life with them. But I also say, I want it to become normal for people who are not paid to be history professors to speak frankly. So, genealogy is complicated in the Bahamas. Shirley Strawn of the National Archives and we had a dream once. When I was a postgraduate student working my thesis, I'd eat my lunch to sit there and chat with the staff a lot. And also, and I worked as a student worker once, so I owe so much to not just to Dr. Saunders, but to the professional staff at that archive. That, like, what would it mean to have like a genealogy center in Carmichael, not to necessarily do things, but where people could just come in and talk about what particularly slavery history means. And not just around, I think the work of, Chris Davis and the Junkin Museum and all of the enormous public history community in the Bahamas is important, but for more ordinary Bahamians to have these conversations, be comfortable in those conversations, to say, "Oh, that gets complicated," and it is, and to know why it gets complicated. They don't, and figuring out the details is hard work. But and that, so I do think that's one of my hopes, and also that we can say, like, "Oh, I know," not just because they heard on this kind of a program, that we came from many different parts of Africa.
Yeah.
All right. And that kind of thing. I want those conversations to just, like the same when we talk about, like, the Queen or colonialism, or, it's the fact that the Moras as a store, the Maura family, that this is
Mm-hmm.
the other we're tied up with this European colonialism. That it's that the things that we share with other parts of the Caribbean. To actually talk about that, to say like the political and social challenges in Haiti right now are real, but that doesn't change the rich and incredible his Haiti changed the history of the world. All right, the first place in the whole Americas,
Mm-hmm.
first Latin America, North America, that when they spoke, when they said we wanted freedom here, we wanted it for everybody. You
Mm-hmm.
know, and that doesn't erase or wipe away what's
Right.
going on in 2024. But to know that and to value it and to love it, to know, I started studying Haitian Creole, which is a lot of fun. It's a fun language because it's like learning like French without all that conjugation nonsense that wastes your time and confuses your brain. It is but like for people to say, like Haitian Creole is for ordinary people to appreciate the way that African language and French influences the making of Haitian Creole.
Right.
Like everybody to talk like that makes us stronger. It also makes stronger young people. That's the
Right.
other thing. Like, this is about exactly, you said we got to practice it. I
Yeah.
want those things to get these slavery studies more in the street, to have it
So,
every day.
so how can the young people, generations, um, of scholars and activists in particular, continue the dialogue?
I would say, and now I will put my school teacher hat on. I never really take it off. I think that one of the things that uh, and we made it's all of our faults. It's no one's fault. I'm not pointing any fingers. And I hate I teach young people. People blame them for. I said, wait a minute. So we misused the internet, didn't come up with good guardrails, and then we look at them and we blame them.
Mm-hmm.
That's cute. All right, that's like us, kind of like it's kind of I can't think of it. It's like feeding exactly. You know what it is? It's like adults giving a 4-year-old too much sugar and then saying, "Boy, you can't go to sleep." I said, you control the sugar you put in. Yeah, it is. I think one of the things that younger generation of scholars and activists can do is to is to do some of the creating that culture. I want book clubs to come back. Let it be the article club, or we can talk about this thing we read on the internet to come back. To
Mm-hmm.
add to be more. Here we are talking on YouTube, and to spend less time in front of our screens, more time with ourselves, to bring back some of the culture
Right.
that of actually talking about this stuff, not just an everyday conversation, but to be deliberate about our reading, that we're to be as dedicated about our book club as we are about our sports league. And that's one of the ways, and I'm not sure what it looks like to change that culture. And
Right.
this is a last question, is kind of a hard question, but to be intentional about it and to be ambitious about it. And like, when people say like, oh, I can't get anyone to do that, I go back to what Daddy said, is people believe some things are the unbelievable, like in that sense. And it's hard everywhere, but I do think sort of believing that we can be people that changes our mindsets, that
You
changes
know.
the reason like I tell people all the time. Sometimes I joke. I said, I'm the sad person at the picnic. I'm the slavery historian. It's a fact. No one wants to talk about that. It's upsetting, but it's also empowering and important. And it's if I didn't
People
have things to do,
people will talk about it when the pain of talking about it becomes significantly less than the pain of not talking about it.
yeah, no, and
Yeah.
that's I think we are stronger for it, and that's the thing, to know this. I'm not, they don't pay me to write this history book, but after 30 years of teaching slavery history, I could probably write down 100 stories of 100 people, just interesting things. To know those people gives us power. And I said, I sat on, this is a good place for me to end. I sat I sat at my sisters and I went high up on the fort the night of the 50th of Independence. I sat on the grass, mostly because one of us, me, really likes fireworks, and so you could
Right.
really see them. But what I was doing, I was looking around, and I'd been doing some research that some on one particular slave ship, and I had some children's names. There's a lot of kids on those slave ships too. A horrible thing that thing was. And I started looking around. And I said, maybe you're their descendant. I want us all to remember that, like, we survived. There's a beautiful. I'm going to shill for one thing. I can't remember because I can't remember. There's one of our Junkanoo community activists is a big voice in it. It is a documentary that an American filmmaker made about Junkanoo. And it's a little bit long. It needs an edit. They had a couple of screenings, but someone says in it, they said, we make this noise of Junkanoo so that our ancestors know that we're alive. We survived. And that's, it is Peter Minshall, when he came, the Trinidadian Carnival art.
Right.
Became, Trinidad Carnival is amazing. I highly recommend it. He says, my God, this thing, it is so sweet. And I don't want, don't get me wrong. I have me and Chris Davis, we can argue, I don't want Junkanoo to run over everything. There's so many other, about our everyday wonderfulness, the way we talk, who we are.
Right.
Survived, and it is, look at us. You can't, look, when we look at we could argue all day about the Christian church, but look at what we did with it and made it our own. And exactly, it is to celebrate this thing, to embrace the transformations that we made, and that will make us more ambitious about the change that we can have.
Right. So let's wrap this up by having you tell us, where do we go from here? Because and put it all in perspective.
Yeah, I think I want. I would say that there are absolutely three things that I think we can certainly do. One is when I was an activist, and I'm not going to start no politics tonight. Someone would ask. I had an acquaintance, Juan, that he said that you should ask yourself every day, what have I done? Like, if I belong to this organization,
right,
what have I done today? At least one thing that advances the goals of this organization. All right. If everybody, young, old, adult, I don't care if you got kids, not kids, whatever, if you're younger than 6, someone's going to have to help you with this. But at the end of every week, all right, if you can say, what did I learn about my history this week? To actually make, what did I learn about my past this week? Just not make it high. Like, I have one of my closest friends from college is Jewish, and their Sabbath is Friday night, and I would spend some time with them. And from the time he could talk, they would ask their son, what did you get this week that you'd like to make sure to take with you next week? What might you like to leave behind? And with raising kids, that's often I really didn't keep my temper this week, and I want to leave that angry little boy behind, kind of thing. But you should say, what did I get this week of my history? That's thing number one. Thing number two, all right, at least once a month, what's the big idea? And it could be the repeated one that you really actually think about. Boy, if we could really do that. And it doesn't mean you have to do anything about it. But I want people to get in the habit of thinking of what's the big change I want for this country, to actually to do one history thing once a week, once a month. All right. Second thing, at least once a month, end of the month, I look at my month, I write in my calendar, I plan my next month, and I think of one big change. If I could radically change the Bahamas, and it could be a change as big as emancipation or as small as fill in the blank. All right. And I it's my personality to do this. For example, one of my pet things, I'd say it once a month, is getting rid of liquid clothes washing soap. Because those things, to ship those things, the amount of oil, and they're messy and they're heavy, and there's a disaster. And there's so many, but big and small things. And I would say the last thing that I really want us to do in terms of the where do we go from here, is, every single week, what did I do for myself this week that makes me stronger so I can be here for the from here? And that means, like, I really need to wake up and meet our health indicators. As some of you listening know, my older sister is the senior dental officer in the Northern Bahamas, is very close to right up on all those health indicators and Ministry of Health matters, and public health matters. So I receive up-to-date information from her as a public health community, and we really, what did I do for myself? Whether it's, sleeping more, reading more, like one of my standards, I have marking to do. I have a paid job that requires me to finish that marking, or I'm gonna have to deal with some grumpy young people tomorrow. But I'm gonna read 20 minutes tonight. I'm either gonna read my Bible or I'm gonna read my novel, because that keeps my brain sharp. All right. It's my non-job reading. It's one of my things that I do for myself. All right. That I said, what am I doing? Not just like I practice history. That's my work in the world. All right. But like one of the things I realized that you weren't intentionally reading other stuff to keep your mind thinking, to do something, and may I recommend to all the Bible readers out there, I'm really enjoying the book of Samuel right now.
Samuel, okay.
Samuel is wild as storytelling goes. Oh my God. Oh my God. I used to have a priest who used to say, like, please don't tell me about Old Testament values, because some of them are very good and some of them are like, oh, what? People, the Old Testament is storytelling. All right. And stories about us. So we know we do some crazy things. So like think about, so it's like try to do one piece of history thing for yourself, even if you just look something up.
Right.
Right. At least once a month. Think about, like, what would I change if I'm the boss of the world? All right. Like if I could change the one thing. And then and actually we need to take better care of ourselves, because we can't do any of it. And whether that's a reading thing, whether that's, like I have taken a phone Sabbath or an internet Sabbath, like because it's not just the exercise, drink water kind of thing, but actually think about yourself as a whole person, because we are, we this is an opportunity moment, but it's also can be a crisis moment. Like we're in a complicated time in the world between global warming,
right?
Between global warming and climate change. We are a low-lying archipelago, but we're also like, we're about to come up on 200 years since the end of slavery. So I want our dreams at about 100, and depending on how you time, 120-ish, 130-ish years after we saw the end of colonialism. Okay. So we're heading up on 200 years since emancipation. There are, children born today to go see the 100th anniversary of that of independence. Like now is the time. Like I think about dates a lot. I'm a historian. Shocking. Think about those big changes, but also we got to be healthy for that. We have to be healthy for that. And forces are conspiring against us. Like the world, the internet is making us read less. All this processed food is making us less healthy. All the ability to not move is making us not move. So
yeah, we have to be intentional.
Yeah, we have to be healthy for the kind of change. Thank you for this program. For the kind of changes this program wants us to do, we actually have to be physically and mentally healthy to do it.
Right. Awesome. But I really, 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 really want to thank you, because I only talk about an hour, and I think we now are 2 and right, and so I know whoever is going to beat me up, you could tell them to come grab me. Yeah, we'll deal with that and so forth. But I really appreciate you taking the time. You were on such a roll. I didn't want to stop you, because there's a lot of information that we really need to get out into circles.
Yeah, this was fun.
In the Bahamas. And so I'm glad that you appreciate it, and I hope we'll be able to bring you back at some point in time to talk about something else.
Yeah, we should. I look forward to doing it again. Okay.
Yes, you do well.
Okay. Bye-bye, audience. Bye-bye. Okay. Night.
So, you heard it from the professor herself. A lot of information she put on the table that we want to hopefully encourage you to dive into, grab some more information on it. Whatever met your fancy. If you found any of this to be value, do hit the like button and share it. so that more people can get access to it, because that's how the social media algorithm systems work. You know, they send them out to more people when you hit likes, etc. And the comments, boy, we have a really hot comment chat groups going on. I wasn't able to keep up with them, so I apologize for not posting all of your comments. But we thank you all for your contribution. Look forward to you next week when we could have some more dialogue, and let us know what it is that you want something to think about, to talk about. And what our whole purpose in life is to talk about things that is not a part of the normal national narrative that could help us build this country from strength to strength, and all of our neighbors and along the way. So until next time, as we move from strength to strength, and I know somebody I'm forgetting to do, but anyway, we'll post it in the chat or so forward. But see you.
Enjoyed the show? Then subscribe to us for more educational and inspirational content. Ring the bell so you never miss a show. Let's change the narrative 242.